Switzerland is famous for its precision watches, its discreet banking system, and, of course, its neutrality. For centuries, while Europe burned through wars, revolutions, and collapsing empires, Switzerland remained intact. Napoleon marched across the continent. Hitler expanded in every direction. Borders were erased and redrawn, and Switzerland stayed. Because of that, people usually ask the same question: why is Switzerland neutral? But that question is misleading. Neutrality is not a moral choice. It is not a legal guarantee. In international politics, neutrality only exists if stronger powers allow it to exist. The real question is not why Switzerland chose neutrality, but why the great powers of Europe accepted it. To understand that, we need to start with a version of Switzerland that looks nothing like the one we know today. For most of its early history, Switzerland was not known for peace. It was known for war, specifically for soldiers. Swiss mercenaries were among the most feared fighters in Europe. They were disciplined, aggressive, and devastating in close combat. Kings, emperors, and popes hired Swiss men to fight their wars. Swiss soldiers fought in Italy, France, and across the Holy Roman Empire. They did not fight for ideology or national loyalty. They fought for money. Even today, the Swiss Guard protecting the Vatican is a surviving symbol of this era. Switzerland was not neutral. It was professional. Violence was a business. That began to change in the early 16th century. At the time, Switzerland was not a unified nation-state. It was a loose confederation of small territories, formerly part of the Holy Roman Empire. When northern Italy became the battleground of Europe, the Swiss believed they had both a claim to Milan and the military strength to enforce it. They were wrong. The Swiss were decisively defeated by France. That defeat mattered far more than any philosophical shift. It forced the Swiss elite to confront an uncomfortable reality. Every major power surrounding them was larger, richer, and capable of raising far greater armies. France, Austria, later Prussia. If Switzerland continued to act like a regional military power, it would eventually be crushed. So, after losing to France, Switzerland signed something unusual for the time: a perpetual peace agreement with France. This was not idealism. It was survival. The Swiss were learning that avoiding wars was cheaper than winning them. Soon after, Europe was shaken by the Protestant Reformation. Switzerland fractured internally along religious lines. Catholic cantons and Protestant cantons no longer trusted one another. Instead of worrying about Italy, France, or the Empire, the Swiss were now consumed by internal tensions and civil conflict. That internal division pulled Switzerland further away from external wars, not because neutrality had become a principle, but because unity had become fragile. By the time Europe entered the 30 Years' War, Switzerland largely stayed out of direct conflict. They continued supplying mercenaries, but avoided committing the Confederation itself. Again, this was not virtue. It was risk management. Then came the shock of 1798. Revolutionary France invaded. The Swiss Confederation collapsed almost immediately. In its place, France imposed the Helvetic Republic, stripping Switzerland of its autonomy and territory. The experiment failed. Napoleon eventually restored a version of the Confederation, though firmly under French influence. When Napoleon fell, the fate of Switzerland was debated by the victorious powers. France had lost the war and no longer had a voice. Prussia wanted Switzerland absorbed into the German Confederation. Austria wanted it turned into a buffer state under Austrian influence. No one trusted anyone else to control it. To prevent future conflict, Russia mediated. The solution was simple and cynical. Switzerland would exist, but it would be permanently neutral. This neutrality was not a Swiss victory. It was imposed. Switzerland would not send troops abroad except for ceremonial service to the Pope. In exchange, the great powers would respect its borders. Everyone agreed because it served everyone's interests. Neutral Switzerland stabilized the center of Europe. During the 19th century, Switzerland became a haven for political dissidents, socialists, nationalists, liberals, and revolutionaries fleeing persecution. This alarmed surrounding powers, who pressured Switzerland to monitor and control these groups. Switzerland reluctantly complied. After a short civil war, it emerged as a more centralized federal state, capable of enforcing internal order and preserving its neutrality. The first true test came with World War I. Germany had no need to cross Switzerland. France did. As the war dragged on, French planners considered flanking German forces through Swiss territory. Switzerland responded by mobilizing its army and concentrating troops along the French border. Combined with the diplomatic consequences of violating Swiss neutrality, France abandoned the plan. Switzerland survived, not because it was harmless, but because it signaled resistance. World War II was more dangerous. Nazi Germany had detailed invasion plans for Switzerland. But the invasion never happened, not because it was impossible, but because it was irrational. Switzerland was mountainous, heavily fortified, and populated by an armed population trained for defense. The cost would have been high, the benefits low. More importantly, a neutral Switzerland was useful. It served as a financial intermediary, a diplomatic backchannel, and a trading hub. Germany could sell gold for Swiss francs and use them to acquire goods elsewhere. At the same time, Germany was bleeding resources on the Eastern Front. Switzerland was simply not worth the price. After the war, Switzerland's neutrality became institutionalized. Geneva was chosen as a major United Nations hub. Yet Switzerland itself refused to join the UN until 2002. Neutrality was not symbolic. It was structural. What Switzerland learned over centuries was simple. Neutrality only works if invading you is more expensive than leaving you alone. Geography helped. Mountains helped, but preparation mattered more. Switzerland did not become neutral because it rejected war. It became neutral because it understood power, fear, and cost better than most countries ever have. What truly transformed Swiss neutrality from a diplomatic label into a hard reality was not treaties or speeches, but engineering. Switzerland did not trust promises. It trusted preparation. And nowhere is that more visible than in how the country prepared for war while claiming it would never fight one. Unlike most neutral states, Switzerland never assumed neutrality would protect it. Instead, it assumed the opposite, that neutrality would eventually be tested. So the Swiss built a country that could not be taken without unbearable cost. Geography gave Switzerland an advantage, but geography alone is never enough. Mountains can be crossed. Passes can be seized, so the Swiss turned their terrain into a weapon. Roads, bridges, tunnels, and railways leading into the country were quietly prepared for destruction. Explosives were embedded directly into infrastructure. If an invasion came, Switzerland would not defend its borders conventionally. It would destroy access to itself. Invaders would not be fighting the Swiss army. They would be fighting gravity, collapsed tunnels, destroyed bridges, and impassable valleys. This was not symbolic defense. It was a self-destruct strategy. Switzerland was willing to cripple its own infrastructure rather than allow it to be used by an enemy. The message was clear. Taking Switzerland would give you ruins, not territory. This logic extended into the mountains themselves. Beginning in the late 19th century and accelerating during World War II, Switzerland drilled into the Alps on an almost obsessive scale. Entire fortresses were hidden inside rock faces. Artillery positions were disguised as barns, houses, and cliffs. What looked like peaceful alpine villages often concealed cannons capable of firing across entire valleys. From the outside, these positions were invisible. From the inside, they were self-sufficient military installations with sleeping quarters, hospitals, generators, water systems, and kilometers of tunnels. These were not meant to project power outward. They were designed to turn every mountain pass into a choke point. Any army entering Switzerland would be forced through narrow corridors where it could be observed, targeted, and destroyed. You could not maneuver. You could not outflank. You could only advance slowly under fire while supply lines collapsed behind you. This was deterrence through inevitability. Even if Switzerland lost, the attacker would lose far more. At the same time, Switzerland built something even more unusual, a military embedded directly into civilian life. Neutrality did not mean demilitarization. It meant total mobilization. For much of the 20th century, Switzerland maintained compulsory military service for men. The idea was simple. Switzerland would never rely on a standing army large enough to threaten its neighbors, but it would maintain the ability to raise one instantly. For decades, soldiers kept their uniforms, rifles, and ammunition at home. If war came, there would be no need for mobilization centers. The army already existed, distributed across the population. This led to an old saying, "Switzerland does not have an army. Switzerland is an army." That statement was not metaphorical. It described a society where military readiness was normalized, quiet, and constant. There were no parades, no foreign deployments, just preparation. During the Cold War, this logic expanded again. Nuclear weapons changed everything. Mountains could still protect, but cities could not. Switzerland responded with a policy almost unmatched anywhere else in the world: universal civil defense. By law, every resident had to have access to a nuclear shelter within minutes of their home. New buildings were required to include bunkers, or residents had to buy space in communal shelters. The state subsidized construction. The result was extraordinary. Switzerland ended up with more shelter capacity than people. These bunkers were not symbolic either. They were equipped with blast doors, air filtration systems, independent power, water supplies, and medical facilities. In peacetime, they became storage rooms, wine cellars, or basements. In theory, they could become lifelines. All of this fed into a single strategic goal: make Switzerland useless to conquer and impossible to occupy. This strategy explains something that often confuses outsiders. Switzerland never tried to look harmless. It tried to look expensive. Neutrality was not advertised as innocence. It was enforced as deterrence. This also explains why Switzerland could remain neutral, while countries like Belgium could not. Belgium was flat, strategically vital, and relatively easy to cross. Switzerland was mountainous, fortified, and deliberately obstructive. Crossing Belgium was a shortcut. Crossing Switzerland was a nightmare. Financial power reinforced this military logic. Swiss banks did not become powerful because Switzerland was neutral. Switzerland remained neutral because its financial system became useful to everyone. During World War II, Switzerland served as a financial intermediary between enemies who could not directly trade or communicate. Gold, currencies, and information passed through Swiss hands. This was morally ambiguous and later controversial, but strategically effective. Neutrality became economically valuable. The same pattern repeated after the war. During the Cold War, Switzerland offered something rare: stability without alignment. It did not host foreign troops. It did not join military blocs, but it was predictable, secure, and deeply integrated into global finance. Geneva became a hub for diplomacy precisely because Switzerland refused to take sides, not because it was passive, but because it was trusted to hold the line. By the late 20th century, Swiss neutrality was no longer just about survival. It had become an asset, a brand, a system. But underneath that calm surface, the logic never changed. Switzerland did not rely on goodwill. It relied on preparation, geography, and the cold calculation that no rational power would benefit from attacking it. Neutrality worked because it was backed by force, not because it rejected it. In the modern world, Swiss neutrality faces a problem it never had to fully confront before: globalization. For most of its history, Switzerland's strategy worked because power moved slowly. Armies marched. Borders mattered. Geography imposed real limits. Today, power moves through money, data, supply chains, and sanctions. Mountains cannot block those. This is where Swiss neutrality becomes complicated. For decades after World War II, Switzerland maintained its position almost effortlessly. The Cold War froze Europe into blocs, and Switzerland sat between them, armed, prepared, but uninvolved. It hosted negotiations, humanitarian organizations, and diplomatic backchannels. Geneva became synonymous with international mediation. The country did not join NATO. It stayed out of the European Union. It even refused to join the United Nations until 2002. Neutrality was not symbolic. It was policy. But neutrality in the 21st century is no longer just about refusing to send troops. It is about choosing whether to participate in economic warfare. Sanctions, financial controls, and access to markets have become weapons. And Switzerland, with one of the most advanced financial systems in the world, sits at the center of that battlefield, whether it wants to or not. The invasion of Ukraine exposed this contradiction brutally. When Russia invaded, the European Union imposed sweeping sanctions. The expectation was immediate. Switzerland would follow. For many outside the country, this seemed obvious. Sanctions were framed as moral necessity. Refusing to join looked like complicity. For Switzerland, it was a crisis of identity. Joining sanctions meant choosing a side. It meant actively harming one belligerent. And by classical definitions, that violates neutrality. For generations, Swiss neutrality meant not helping or hurting any party to a conflict. Mediation was acceptable. Humanitarian aid was acceptable. Economic punishment was not. Yet refusing sanctions carried its own risks. Switzerland's banks and markets are deeply connected to Europe and the United States. Ignoring sanctions could isolate Switzerland economically, damage its reputation, and even provoke retaliation. Neutrality suddenly had a cost. Switzerland chose to adopt the EU sanctions. This decision triggered intense internal debate. Some argued neutrality had already evolved and that economic measures were not the same as military action. Others argued this was a fundamental break with 2 centuries of policy. If neutrality collapses under pressure, was it ever real? The argument exposed a deeper truth. Swiss neutrality was never absolute. It always depended on context. It survived because it aligned with the interests of stronger powers. When those interests shift, neutrality must adapt or disappear. This is the uncomfortable lesson many countries misunderstand when they look at Switzerland and ask whether they can copy its model. Most cannot. Swiss neutrality works because of a rare combination of factors. Geography still matters. Switzerland remains difficult to invade, expensive to occupy, and easy to defend. Social cohesion matters. The population accepts conscription, preparedness, and collective responsibility. Institutions matter. Swiss governance is stable, predictable, and trusted internationally. And history matters. Neutrality was embedded into the European order by external powers long ago. Most small states lack some or all of these advantages. A flat country without natural barriers cannot deter invasion the same way. A divided society cannot mobilize quietly and effectively. A state without financial credibility cannot make itself economically indispensable, and a country without historical legitimacy as a neutral actor will not be treated as one when pressure comes. Neutrality is not declared. It is earned, enforced, and constantly renegotiated. Switzerland also understood something most countries do not. Neutrality does not mean weakness. In fact, it requires strength. Swiss defense policy was never designed to win wars. It was designed to make wars irrational. That distinction is crucial. The bunkers, the destroyed bridges, the armed population, the civil defense shelters, these were not signs of paranoia. They were signals to every potential aggressor that Switzerland would not be a prize. It would be a liability. This logic still shapes Swiss policy today, even as the tools change. Military invasion may be unlikely, but financial coercion, cyber pressure, and political influence are not. Switzerland's challenge is no longer defending mountain passes. It is defending autonomy in a world where neutrality is increasingly viewed as moral failure rather than strategic position. Yet despite the pressure, Switzerland has not abandoned its core approach. It still avoids military alliances. It still refuses permanent foreign bases. It still emphasizes mediation and humanitarian roles. And it still invests in preparedness, quietly, without spectacle. The lesson of Switzerland is often misunderstood. It is not a story about peace. It is a story about realism, about understanding power early, accepting limitations, and designing a system that minimizes exposure to catastrophic risk. Switzerland did not escape history by being virtuous. It survived history by being cautious, disciplined, and brutally honest about its position in the world. Neutrality, in the Swiss sense, is not about standing above conflict. It is about standing just far enough away from it that everyone involved decides it is not worth pulling you in. That balance is becoming harder to maintain. But it is precisely because it is difficult that Switzerland remains one of the few countries that has managed it at all. In a world that increasingly demands alignment, Switzerland's neutrality is no longer invisible. It is contested, and that may be the final test of whether neutrality can still exist as a strategy, not just as a myth.